Hey Stella, thanks very much for joining. It's much appreciated. If you could start by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, and it's very nice to meet you, Alex. So, I'm Stella Collins. I'm currently co founder and chief learning officer at Star Labs. I'm the author of a book, Neuroscience for Learning and Development, and some other business books too. I'm very passionate about really effective learning, and that all comes from my really strong interest in our brains, how we process information, how we learn, how we think. I was a psychologist. I studied psychology, worked in IT for a long time, and then kind of fell into learning and development. So this kind of passion for how our brains and bodies are connected, how we learn, how we process information, how we communicate are kind of my key areas of fascination.
So taking you back to school around that sort of time, how was your learning then? How were your early learning experiences?
I loved school. I was a very good student. I went to a very good school, so that probably helped. But I loved school. I loved learning things. I enjoyed the kind of, discovering new stuff. I really liked the practical stuff. And I kind of liked most of the subjects at school as well. I was probably a bit of a swap. But yeah, for me, I've always enjoyed learning, whether it's formally in school or learning outside. I guess I'm just very curious. I think I was always curious. So education, training, learning, discovering things, discovering new places. I've lived in multiple countries. I guess I like novelty. I'm quite curious.
And so obviously you went to school, you enjoyed it, and then where from there?
Okay, so I went to school and then I did what was very typical in those days, straight to university, no kind of gap year or anything like that at that point. Went to university, studied psychology, and it was a science-based psychology course. So again, there was a lot of brain science in there, which I just found utterly fascinating. And it answered a lot of kind of questions I'd had around how people behave and why they behave like they do, and why we sometimes don't know why we behave like we do, because sometimes our brains are doing things that we're perhaps not consciously aware of. So I studied psychology and I was thinking of becoming a speech therapist because I got very interested in communication. Did a master's in human communication, which again was very science, an MSc, very science based. But at that point, if I wanted to carry on with becoming a speech therapist, I was going to have to carry on studying. And I've been, at school and university forever. So I wanted to get a job. And at that time in the 1980s, there were a lot of jobs in IT. So I ended up working as a COBOL programmer, an IT specialist for probably 10 or 15 years. And that was really interesting. And it wasn't really anything to do with psychology, but I would use the psychology just in terms of, communicating with people. I was often the communicator between the really, really techie people and the kind of the more business orientated people. So I guess I was using my psychology in a practical way and kept up with, reading books about how we behave, books about behavior, books about science, kept that up. And then it's more than 20 years ago now, but I was given this job that was when we moved to New Zealand. So we lived in New Zealand for 4 years. And that was a great way of learning. That was a really good way of learning how to be in different countries, work with different people. And I was still working in IT, but I got back from there and I got this job that was uh, IT support and training manager. And I thought I can do the IT support bit, but I wasn't going to do the training manager bit because having worked in IT, all the training I'd ever had was absolutely terrible. And I thought, what a horrible job. I would hate to stand in front of people, have them look bored and clearly, not really learn anything. So that wasn't what I wanted to do. But I took on a very inspirational trainer to do the job for me. I was the manager. And she kept saying to me, Stella, this is all about the psychology of people. You're going to be good at this. You like coaching people. You like helping people get better at what they do. And I kind of accidentally fell into the learning world and initially really wanted to change the world of L&D in IT. But all those big companies at the time, Oracle, Microsoft, probably still, they're making hand over fist lots of money from the training they do, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. They're still making money from it. So they didn't care. And I then fell into working with communication skills and training communication skills for 15, 20 years with my previous company. So you were asking about entrepreneurship earlier on. I think, I set up a company 20 years ago in the UK.
What made you decide to, take the plunge and set up a company?
Partly because I'd worked in big companies and I didn't like that. I'm not a big company sort of person, I guess. I'd worked in small and medium-sized companies, and I did quite enjoy that. But at the time that I was kind of looking around, I don't think I felt quite confident enough to take on I was kind of senior in my position in terms of IT, and I didn't feel quite comfortable enough to take on a senior role within a bigger company. And what I wanted to do was a bit niche. So I felt the only thing I could do was kind of set up my own company, really. And I wanted to be very specific around working part-time, working around my family. So it felt like that would be the best thing to do. And I met a group of people actually who were they were a training company, but all were independent contractors. So it kind of came out of that, partly my own not quite knowing what else I could do, and partly because that was the way they worked. So I thought, well, that seems like a good way to work. And then I just really enjoyed being self-employed, starting a small business.
And how did that go, growing it, starting out self-employed and then growing it into a small business? How was that?
It was really nice. It was very organic. So at first, I did absolutely everything, but I quickly realized, for instance, that I could do my own IT support, but I'd end up spending a whole day on IT support and not on training. So I thought, okay, so the first thing I need to do is pay somebody to do my IT support. Then I realized I was spending a lot of time on, invoicing and things, and I'm terrible at it and I didn't enjoy it. So I thought I'll get somebody to help me with the administration piece. So we just grew really organically. Obviously, every time you take on somebody new, you have to generate more income in order to pay those people. But by doing the things that I was now motivated and good at, training, I began to put up my training rates, which meant I could then pay other people to do things, and then eventually started to get bigger projects where I was taking on other trainers to work for me, beginning to build a reputation so that clients would have us back again, referred us on to other clients. So then I developed quite a big group of a network of trainers who were working with me, usually kind of really specific ones. I had my kind of favorite, not favorites. We had the people who really believed in the way we did things and were our regulars, but there was always another group to call on. So yeah, it kind of grew very, very organically, and that was pretty successful.
And what was the most challenging thing that you faced?
I think the most challenging thing for any company is getting sales. It's always tying down the sales. I'm a huge enthusiast. I'm an optimist. So I always think that this conversation is going to turn into, a great sale. And my husband sometimes has to remind me that, is that conversation really leading somewhere or is it not? So I think with any company, that's always the hardest thing is getting sales and then making sure that you're profitable with those sales.
And how did you go about doing that? So obviously, I speak to a lot of business owners and they're really good at, say, training or their area of expertise, but then they come into business, starting a business, and sales is the hardest thing if they haven't been prior trained in it. Did you have prior experience in sales, or did you learn on the job? Or
No, I would say I learned on the job. I'm quite a natural learner, so I probably read quite a lot of books on sales. I talked to a lot of other people. I was very lucky to collaborate and partner with other people. So I think that helped, that we kind of could help each other and support each other, and learn from each other around what was working. We got a couple of big contracts, which really helped, because then once you've got one big contract, then it's much easier to kind of get into another big contract. So that really helped. And I think it was another learning curve for me. To understand how business worked was just another thing to start learning. So I did quite a lot of these kind of courses that the government support or local government supports, with kind of helping small business owners grow. So I did quite a lot of those, which just kept helping me kind of understand how that worked. I always wanted to do something bigger and grow a bigger company, but I knew I needed a business partner to do that. So I was looking for somebody who believed in the learning world, somebody who believed in the way I wanted learning to happen. And that wasn't happening until I moved to Spain. And then I was working for a client in Belgium, and this client in Belgium who, I was doing the same thing. I was doing some audits, some consulting, some training for them. And then he said, actually, I want to start a new training company, and I think you'd be a good business partner. So that was when we started Stella Labs, because we thought that we had complementary skills.
and so you've started Stella Learning, I believe that was 20 years ago, and you started Stella Labs quite recently. How did the two? I know you said that Stella Labs you wanted to grow a bigger company. How did the two differ?
So Stella Learning was very much a training company. Stella Labs, we quite quickly decided we wanted to be to have a digital platform. We were already using a real blend, blended learning. So we were using another platform, but we decided we wanted to build our own platform. So that's how it's separated. Stella Learning was a consulting company that used digital technology. Stella Labs has become a digital technology company that still does consulting, because we still do consult with clients as well. So that's the shift. And that's a much harder job.
Why
Selling
so?
is harder than selling consulting.
Why is that?
I think because there's a lot of software out there, you've got to differentiate yourself very carefully. People have already got lots of software already. So, you've got to kind of displace another piece of technology or integrate with another piece of technology. And it just seems it's just a much more, and there's a lot more investment. As a consultant, you can go, you're selling your time as a consultant. With technology, you're having to create a product, and that takes a lot more time and a lot more money. A lot more investment.
And would it be right in thinking that you've gone down primarily the technology route because it's more scalable, and if you do obviously sell more of it, you can expand easier and a lot more scalable consulting?
Yeah. Yes, it's scalable, because if you're just a people company, you're only as scalable as the people you've got.
And how's it gone so far? Like how have the past 5 years looked?
Challenging, always challenging, and there's always something new, always something different, always something that you hadn't foreseen coming up. I'm very fortunate that I have a co-founder who does some of. I do the kind of the front of house, the being seen, the talking piece, things like podcast review. I still do the consulting work, and he manages more the kind of the business, driving the business part of it. I still get involved in a lot of sales. I mean, I'm heavily involved in the sales element, but the kind of the funding, the financing, all those bits that I already said I didn't like doing when I was a small company. I still don't like doing, and I'm not good at them. I'm happy to accept that. I'm much happier that somebody else does that, and I partner with people, I work with people to do the bits that they're good at. And that's actually something that I think is really important in learning, that if you can help people do the things that they're good at, that helps everybody feel better, rather than trying to be all things to all people.
Totally agree with that. Yeah, I think like the sign of a good manager or a CEO is that you can hire good people and get them, because at the end of the day, no one's going to be able to do everything. And if you try to do that, you spread yourself too thin. Yeah. So you said it's been challenging, obviously, with things like fundraising, that sort of thing. And it's actually quite a difficult economic climate in the last 3 or 4 years as well. So
Yeah. Yes, if we'd started 5 years ago, life could be very different.
Yeah, because I remember seeing like a lot of businesses starting in COVID, and that was when everyone was at home, and all there was like these online learning, everything, that sort of thing, boom. And then 2021, I think since 2021, the economy has been going downwards, and it seems incredibly difficult.
Yeah, and training is often the first thing that gets kicked out of businesses, because on the whole, there's not enough. It's hard to measure business impact, and a lot of training people don't measure business. We try really hard to make sure that we link any training we do, and our platform as well, links the learning piece to business impact. We talk about transfer objectives. So what do you need people to do, not just what do you need them to know. And a lot of training still, unfortunately, is very heavily based on, here's some information. So a lot of lecture-based training, and e-learning, which is just, here's information. We don't really care whether you actually can do anything with that information or not. And that's something I'm very passionate about, that what we need to have in terms of effective learning and learning that has impact in the business world, you need to have people being able to do the things that you want them to be able to do. And that's much more difficult than just providing content, because people have to, practice regularly over and over again. They have to fail, and you've got to be prepared to let them fail. You've got to give them feedback. You've got to have good mechanisms for feedback, to have feedback in place. And learning takes time. That shift of all those neurons in your head is not an instantaneous. We can't just make it happen in a moment. It takes time for new behaviors, new habits, new ways of working to actually embed. It needs a lot of organizational support as well, and that's sometimes lacking.
Very true. And yeah, I would agree that as you mentioned earlier, a lot of these big companies, they don't really care about learning and development and the sort of e-learning that they provide sense. Obviously, they care about the development of their employees. It wouldn't be as successful. But it's interesting that how do you go about really hammering it in that companies can benefit from e-learning and these sort of solutions, and
I think
rather
companies
than
only benefit from e-learning if they use e-learning as part of a bigger picture. So I don't think companies can benefit from just e-learning on its own, because it needs that kind of, why am I doing this e-learning? And is it relevant to what my job is? Is it relevant to where I want to go? Is there some follow-up to this e-learning? So, so much of it, and that's not to criticize the e-learning industry. It's to say that e-learning is a very valuable thing, but it's only part of a learning process. So if you're learning, the way I talk to people is I say, how did you learn? The question I ask more often than any other is, how did you learn to ride a bike?
I learned to ride a bike by falling off many times and just doing it.
Yeah, doing it over and over again and going from a small bike to a bigger bike. You probably had support from, your dad or your mum or your big brother running behind you. You had trainer wheels. There's a long journey to learn to ride a bike. Now, okay, you might learn some work procedures quicker than that. But that process of I need to want to ride a bike. I need to want a need to do this thing, whether it's, I want to do it because I love it or because I have a need in order to do my job better. But you have to have a motivation to do something. You have to have some initial understanding of what is a bike. You wouldn't want to ride a bike if you didn't know what a bike was. So you have to have some initial materials, some guiding materials, some guidance from somebody. You need to experiment. That's the falling off part, and kind of get that feedback and practice. Then you need to actually apply it. So, you need to ride your bike in the context of, I want to get from A to B. So you need to ride to school, for instance, where you might start. And I live in Belgium, everybody rides to school here. But, they often ride with their parents to school when they're little. And then as they get bigger, they ride on their own. And then finally, there's the piece that is really important is that, especially if we're trying to learn factual stuff, our brains are actually evolved to forget, not to remember. So we need to use space practice, space repetition to actually help people remember the knowledge and the skills they need. So that's how I kind of go about asking people, in terms of the learning that you're delivering at work, are you covering all those elements? Or, as very often happens, it's just the guide materials. You get a lot of information, but then you're kind of left abandoned to deal with the rest on your own.
And I think it's interesting how you just mentioned about space repetition, something like that. That's a word or a phrase I only learned when I was in my 20s, and it's interesting how we don't learn these. We never learn how to learn. And I was speaking to another founder who started a company, space repetition software, and he's like, the biggest challenge to them is getting people to understand about these concepts. Do you find that's a challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, because people have got successful people in particular. They succeeded through school, through university, through business, despite the fact that the training wasn't all great. And they've got used to the idea that, when I have training, I sit in a room and I kind of usually sit, and probably listen to somebody. And you might, if you're lucky, you get a bit of an experience with a workshop. If you're a leader, you might get to go on a leadership course where you do some outward bound stuff. I mean, I'm being really, really kind of exaggerating it a bit here. But we learned to do our jobs despite some of the training we had, rather than because the training was really good. You sometimes get learning programs or learning experiences that are really good and stick with you forever. But I think, it's that kind of problem of trying to explain to people that this is how learning really happens. It can't happen just by watching a video, just by doing some e-learning, even just by reading a book. I mean, books are fantastic. But you can, how many self-help books have we all read and thought, yes, that's really good, isn't it? And then, a week later, you're just back to doing whatever it was you were doing before because you didn't put the work in.
I definitely say I've read many books, but how many books can I actually remember? And I find that's the same with a lot of people. It's like, again, that's probably spaced repetition. If you read a page once and then it's done, it's how are you ever gonna?
Yeah, the only way to really remember what you read in a book is to read it again, to take notes, to apply what you're learning, and if it's a learning type book. But even if it's a novel, you've either got to read it again or watch the film or talk to friends about it. It has to be a really memorable book for you to actually really remember what happened. Read it multiple times.
And do you find that obviously you've got a limited time? How do you manage to convince people about this sort of thing? Like, this is how you've got to learn. It's so much information. How do you get it delivered concisely?
So I think, well, I use examples, so like I just gave you the bike one,
Yes.
and get people to actually do that for themselves, to think it through for themselves. So you get them to use the power of their own brain to help with the convincing, to talk about, can you think of examples where you were apparently learning something and actually you didn't ever build the skill or were able to, acquire the knowledge? And most people can. Or if they can't, they think, yeah, I can't remember that because we didn't do any of that follow-up stuff. We didn't do any of the stuff that really builds the learning. And then to talk about it in terms of the business impact. If you've got hundreds or thousands of people spending their time on compliance training, for instance, one of the challenges of compliance training is it's usually very, very dull. It's not very exciting. And it's not, I don't need it today. There's no immediate need for it. The fire extinguisher safety training, you might get that once a year, but you don't need it on the day that there's a fire. The money laundering training, I have no idea how often people are asked to do something dodgy. But, unless it's a real need right now, you have the money laundering training or the cybersecurity training, and then 2 weeks later, you've forgotten it because it just wasn't engaging enough.
Yeah, I think most training is definitely not engaging and forgetful, and that's my experience. Every company I've been at.
That's not necessarily the trainer's fault because they've been tasked with, the trainer or e-learning designer, whatever it might be. They've been tasked with supporting people to, with delivering this information. That's what they're tasked with. And they're not given the opportunity to do the bigger picture. So, yeah, and like I said, compliance training, for most of the time, it's irrelevant. You don't need it until you really need it. And when you really need it, you've usually forgotten.
It makes me think that when you say that, I think when it comes to compliance training, anti-money laundering, all these sort of things, I guess it's more about companies trying to protect their backs rather than actually cementing the learning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that's what it's about. So the purpose, it meets its purpose. Companies don't get sued because they can say, we did the compliance training. So it meets its purpose in that sense. But where it frustrates me is people then associate that with that's how we learn around here. And they then say, well, I don't like learning. I find it boring or it wastes my time. I mean, that's what a lot of people often say, I haven't got time to do the learning. And if it hasn't got a purpose for you as an individual, of course you haven't got time for it. You've got other things that are really pressing and you have got a need to do. But I think that's one of the challenges then, that then becomes kind of the perception of learning. People actually really enjoy learning when they get a really good opportunity to learn something, whether it's formal or informal. That ability to, when people have learned a new language, when they've learned to play an instrument or they've learned to do a sport, people really enjoy that. And everybody recognizes if you're learning a language, doing a sport, playing an instrument, nobody expects to be able to do that in a 2-hour or a 2-day learning course. Why do we expect people to be able to learn complex skills or complex processes in that amount of time? It's like a mismatch.
Tell me about what made you want to write a book?
I've always liked writing. Even at school, I said I was a SWAT. I liked writing essays, and I probably didn't do very much writing at all when I was working in the IT world. But as soon as I moved into training, and I was reading all these interesting articles, and I thought, well, I've got some ideas here, and I want to share these ideas. So I think my first writing gig was with Training Journal. I wrote some articles for them, just short posts when it was a proper printed magazine. And that got me really thinking about, enjoying it. And I did that regularly. I wrote blogs. I had a weekly blog that I wrote for our website. So I did that. And then I wrote a couple of short, there's a whole set of books called pocket books, which are just very short. I don't know if you come across them, but they're, very practical. So I did 2 of those. Those were really fun. And then I just really thought there's no books out there on the science of learning, or there's some, but, there's none that are saying what I want to say and that are practical enough for if I was a trainer, which I was, are practical enough for me to be able to pick up and understand the science of it, but also to be able to do the practical bit. So at that point, I kind of started thinking, I really want to write a book that is based on the science, but is very translatable and practical. And I was just lucky that I was talking to another person who was an author, Amy Brown at the time. She said, I've just been approached to write a book and I haven't got the time and I don't want to. And I think you'd be the right person to do this book. And so she referred me to Kogan Page and the rest is history. We wrote the first one, and then it's now in its third edition and published in about 6 different languages, I think. So, and I want to write some more.
What's next? What would you like to else would you like to write?
I was just having a really interesting conversation with my co-founder, actually, and I really want to write a book on helping parents, how to bring up your children, because there are some books on that, but there's lots of books on babies, but there's fewer on how to bring up your children. So I'd love to do that, but I think that's a post-work. I think that's a retirement project. Right now, I'm interested in possibly writing something on how we work with neurodiversity in the workplace. And that's something I'm quite often asked about. Or I think there's a huge change in work at the moment. I think people are being asked much more to learn on their own. So companies are still doing these big training courses, but less. And I think, as L&D gets cut, people are getting asked to do more of their own learning. And I think if people understood how to, we were just talking about it earlier on, you weren't ever taught how to learn. So I think if people understood how learning really happened, and if organizations understood, if we're going to create a self-directed learning culture, how will that work? Then I think that would be a really interesting. And again, I'd want it to be practical. So, the practical aspects of how do you go about helping other people to learn if you're running a big company.
And you mentioned on ADHD, neurodiversity in the workplace. Like, what are your thoughts on that? I'd love to hear more about that.
I just think it's a very interesting area. I mean, in some ways, all our brains work the same. Everybody has pretty much the same pattern to our brain, but of course, every single individual brain is different. And it only needs a small shift, a pattern in an area to change things. It's an area I really want to do some more research on, because we know our brains are neuroplastic. So we know our brains can change. We know things like digital technology is already impacting on how brains function. And brains just adapt to the environment they find themselves in. I also think what we call diverse is different at different times. Just as an example, in the Victorian days, so 100, 150 years ago, people were not expected, men in particular, were not expected to show their emotions. That was considered a very poor thing to do. That's not to say they didn't have those emotions, but they were expected to suppress them. Now it's perfectly acceptable. In fact, it's positively weird if men don't show their emotions. That's a social change that has happened that has now enabled men to behave, and I'm just saying men for an example, to behave differently. And I think there's so whilst neurodiverse brains are different, they're also similar. And I think if we can adapt a world to suit people with neurodiversity, that can also actually help everybody. So I can give you a really good example of that, a practical example. If you have a text that is centrally justified, so all the lines look neat down the side, which publishing often has, it creates these kind of white spaces in the text that are uneven. And it makes it hard for somebody with dyslexia to read it. It actually makes it slightly harder for all of us. But for most of us, if we're not dyslexic, we adapt to it. We adapt to it quite quickly. And a friend of mine who's got ADHD, she talks about people with, neurodiverse traits, whatever they might be. They're kind of like the cuckoo not the cuckoo, the canary in the mine, that they notice things that the rest of us kind of put up with. Still impacts on us, but we kind of deal with it, we cope with it. And people with neurodiversity, it's just they have to use more energy to put up with that challenge. So I think, by examining, exploring neurodiversity, we can possibly help everybody. But I also think we need to help people who are neurodiverse to also fit in. We have to help society accept that, but we also have to help them fit into the society we have.
It's really interesting. And yeah, from my experience, I have ADHD and I ended up finding I didn't really fit in that well at workplaces. So I started my own thing. And I think I see that a lot amongst like entrepreneurs, business owners, whatever word you want to use, there's like really high rates of neurodiversity. And I do wonder if that's because the workplace, the school place, any institutions aren't really geared towards these people, so they end up doing their own thing. So yeah, I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, it's entirely possible, and I'm quite sure there's probably some data out there that would would show one way or another. Yes, I guess if you're very standard, you probably find it easier to fit into the sausage machine of school or big business. Or maybe you're just more adept at dealing with that fitting in. It's never, you're never going to be able to say it's one thing or another, because it's going to depend on different people. Some people absolutely need to have a job in an organization because, they've got 4 children or 3 children, or, two cats and a dog at home that they need to feed. So they have to stick in their job, and they just have to learn to endure whatever it is they have. Some people are more inclined, have more energy, are more optimistic, and can potentially step outside and take that risk. But I think one of the really interesting things is almost everybody you speak to, if you talk to them at a deeper level, almost everybody you speak to says there are times when they feel not part of the group. They don't feel they connect. They feel they're different. They feel they're alienated. I don't think I've ever met anybody who says, oh, yes, I'm definitely part of the group. Almost everybody feels different, because physically we are, but we are our own person. And only you are like you, only I am like me. You might meet other people who are similar, but you're never going to meet, well, hopefully if we don't have doppelgangers and clones, you're never going to meet somebody exactly the same. So everybody feels a bit isolated sometimes, I think.
And I see you've got a lot of books on that shelf, so you must do a lot of reading as well as writing. What's the best book you've read,
The best book I
if you
read,
have a favorite?
I do have a favorite business book, and that is Influence, Science and Practice by Robert Cialdini. It's a really well-written book. He's a really fascinating man. I was lucky enough to work with him for a short time, so that was really cool. And I just think it's a book that everybody should read, because we all have to influence, and it's based on really good research, because it's based on kind of university-based research, but also he went out and he just did lots of different jobs and kind of observed how do people influence. And for me, it's a really smart way of capturing what is a complex social skill and putting it into a kind of a process and categories that you can follow. And I really love that. I think, we have a lot of complex social skills, and it's very hard if you say to somebody, you need to be more confident, you need to be a better negotiator, you need to be a better influencer. That's a bit fluffy. But if you can say, hey, look, here's 6 steps, or here's 6, then that just helps you get started. The subtleties would all come later. That's why I really like that book. I think it's a great book.
I've only heard good things about that, and I see, yeah, like you say, I think it's a well-researched book, because a lot of books in that sort of area around self-help, sales, influence can be a bit wishy-washy, so it looks like more of a better one. And thanks ever so much for giving your time to come on. It's great to hear about your long-time business, the writing the books, and your interesting experiences and opinions on learning.
Thank you very much, Alex. I enjoyed talking to you.